Thank you. Hello and good afternoon. This is our dissertation research seminar, first this year. Good for you for making it into a new place, finding it. Although some of you are in the wrong group, aren't you? I know who you are. Yeah. That's all right, as long as there's space, right? So if there's not, you'll be the first to go. But we're here, and we'll talk about dissertation. So last term we took it easy. We had only 2 seminars. We talked very generally about what a dissertation is, what a research question is, what a literature review is. This term is the exciting term where we're taking a step towards practice. We'll be talking about how specifically you should be doing it. We'll talk about methods, we'll talk about research design. So this is the term where you will start your actual work. This is the exciting period of your degree when you will finally do something original, contributing to theory, empirical or theoretical, but it will be yours. You'll contribute to the world, you'll contribute to the theory or method or field, and you should be really excited about it. Are you really excited about that? Yay! I am. So we'll start this discussion with talking about research design, which includes methods, but also links to theory and links to research question. So, just to recap, last time we talked about, if you remember, it was a long time ago, but we talked about literature review, and it was a bit dry because you haven't started your literature review, so I'll just remind you a little bit as you start thinking about it again. So we talked about the literature review as something that you will have in your dissertation. It will be a very important section of your work. And we talked about how this is not just a section that will summarize literature, not just a section that will talk about what scholars think about this issue, but it will also provide a critical view. It will tell the reader what is important about these works, what are the missing things in the literature, how does the different strand of literature compare. So we talked about this critical aspect where a literature review will not be just searching through what has been done on this topic, but the outcome of this search. Where do we stand now? Where do you stand as a researcher, having researched it? Which gap will you then intend to fill? And we also talked about dissertation in terms of what should be in the dissertation. So we said that very broadly, dissertation should give you the tools to express intellectual grasp of the topic and relevant debates. It should have a narrative, it should be logical, it should make sense from the beginning and the end, that this is your argument. If somebody asks you, what is the argument in your dissertation? You have to summarize those 1,500 words in one sentence. You say, this was my argument. It has to critically engage with the literature, and it has to critically engage with methodology. So it has to say not only what methods you used, but why you used them. Why this method and not something different. And in terms of writing, it will be written in a clear way. It will be organized in a logical way, going from one issue that will connect to a next issue. And it will be presented in sections that make sense for any reader, not just an expert in this field. And throughout the dissertation, as we said, you will be referencing different types of literature. You'll be building on something that already exists. You'll be saying, this has been done, this hasn't been done. This method has been used in this area by these people, but perhaps not in this context. So we stopped here last time, and I received many emails about various things, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. So keep coming with your emails and questions about the dissertation. You can be asking very soon these questions to your supervisor, which will be allocated to you next month.
But for now, I'm happy to answer any questions. Many questions are answered just by looking by the dissertation Keats area and the handbook. But still, please do not be in the dark if you have any doubts of how your dissertation should look like, about the format, about the submission. Just ask me. Lastly, as a form of recap, we talked about various things that will go into your dissertation. Your dissertation will probably have some of these, maybe all, but not necessarily all. We didn't talk how much of this content is counted into your word limit. This information is there in faculty pages, but I go through it quickly today. Just looking forward, just so you know how much is actually expected. So this is talking about the non-project-based dissertations, right? Some of you might do a project. A project will be slightly different because you will do something. You will design a web page. You will design a piece of code, perhaps. And that means that the written part of your dissertation might be shorter, right? Might be around 10,000 words rather than 12 to 15. But that's something for you to discuss with your supervisor. I will be talking here about the non-project dissertations, which will be between 12 and 15,000 words. And this is the limit you cannot go over. You will be penalized for going over 15,000 words. What goes into those 15,000 words is your main text, any quotes, any footnotes, any endnotes, and this is the wording from faculty pages, appendices consisting of original material. I'll explain that in a second. What is excluded from the word count, so what doesn't count into those 1,500 words, is everything that we call front matter, which is your title of your dissertation, cover sheet, table of contents, table of figures, any acknowledgements, any dedication if you want to dedicate this dissertation to your dog, and so on. Any abstracts, glossary if it contains any specialist words that you need to first deal with and to say, well, this is the abbreviations I will use. This is what this word means. So this is all excluded. But also, raw data in appendices will also be excluded. So there could be two types of appendices. So an appendix is something added at the end of dissertation, could include raw data or analysis or results of this raw data. So stuff like translations or transcripts of your interviews, or images from videos that you will analyze, or interview guides, the list of questions you ask to your people. Survey example, right? If you're doing a survey, so this actual survey that you asked people. What else? If you do some kind of visual analysis or textual analysis, the whole corpus of all the text that you analyzed. This is raw data, right? If you analyzed 10 different web pages, this goes into appendix, right? So this is not counted, right? However, if you use your appendix to introduce any original material, such as, well, it didn't fit into the dissertation, but I will include it in the appendix, such as, well, I didn't have time to talk about my interview process or about the context of this phenomenon in my country. This is a brief background on internet usage in Germany. Boom. That's original content. That counts into the word count, right? Because that's part of your dissertation. Is that distinction clear? Yeah. So any raw data, again, any raw data doesn't count into your dissertation if you put it in the appendix. But any sort of original thoughts, original material will. If you have any examples that are not covered by it, I'm happy to talk about them later. Okay, just to remind everyone, your nearest deadline is in a week and a half, 5th February 2019, by 3 p.m. 59 seconds.
you need to submit your dissertation abstract via Keats.
You have to do it in order to be assigned a dissertation supervisor with whom you will work for the remaining of this term. So this is very important. Please, if you haven't already, please start thinking about it now. What is it you want to do with your dissertation? Do you think there are relevant people in the faculty that could work with you? It might be a good idea to start discussing it with professors and faculty members. And next week, 5th February, this is where you submit it. As I said, we will meet around there and we will talk about what to do next. But very broadly, next you will be submitting text to your supervisor, you'll be working with them, you will be submitting outlines, and I recommend submitting drafts once you engage in writing. You will receive feedback by May and June, and the second very important deadline is, as I mentioned numerous times, 15th of May, which is the ethics application deadline. This is very important because if you don't do it on time, you cannot simply do your research. It will not be approved ethically, and if it's not, then your research cannot be conducted. So then you'll work independently, and then finally 5th September 2019, 4 p.m. Before 4 p.m. is where you have to submit your final work. So that's not really much what you have to do by February 5th, but it's very important that you do it. You need to pick a research question, which we talked about last time, an abstract, example of literature that you think is relevant, some keywords, and optional, a potential supervisor, but you don't have to include it if you have no idea. The submission is on Keats. There's a submission area. You can start submitting now. The form is there as well, so everything should be there. But any questions about dissertation abstract submission? Yes.
The number is K number or the, name and number.
Yes.
So the number is the begin with K or the numbers.
I don't know. Let's see the form. Yes, I know. Oh, come on. Yeah, I don't know my key number. Okay. So, I don't know. It's not particularly specified here. So, let me get back to you on Monday. Okay?
And also the program. So what should be, because I was doing the form before the session, and so I was thinking, what is about the program?
So your program, are you doing an MA in Big Data and Society, or MA in UDAM, right? So there are people from all programs here, all across the board. So what is your MSc program? Anything else? All clear? So we're here in seminar 3. We have four more to go in terms of compulsory seminars which will take place in here. We start talking about methods today, and then we start talking about particular methods from 8th of February, starting with interviews, then qualitative analysis, then quantitative analysis, and then finally we'll talk about writing up. This will be the end of March, so it'll be a good time to talk more constructively about where you are, where you should be, how to bring it all together. Now, I mentioned optional seminars. So,
there will be a number of optional seminars. You have the schedule on Keats, right? There's a number of them depending on which method you think is relevant to your dissertation. So the schedule is there. I will show it in a second. You can start signing up to those workshops next Monday. I will send you all links to register to book your place for the optional workshops. Don't sign up to all of them. They can take a limited number of students. Please sign up to those that you think you need training in, to those that you think you require skills in order to pursue your research. The workshop materials will be posted on Keats, where there are any slides or other links. So even if you don't attend, you'll have the opportunity to learn from those. So there they are, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 optional seminars starting from February the 1st, so next Friday. The first 2 are more broadly about study skills and about researching topics. So the first one will be about finding sources, something that we covered a bit, but Kristen will go deeply into where to start finding your literature, where to start finding appropriate materials. Then Brittany will talk about brainstorming your project. So this is 15th of February. You will have, ideally, thought about your abstract by then. You will have it submitted. And you will think about your abstract then. What's next? Right? How to get from your dissertation abstract that you submitted to your final dissertation abstract. So it will try to develop your original thoughts, your first kind of thing that you've written, those 300 words from an abstract, what to do next. And then the next 5, 6 workshops are again about methods. So the next 5 are about methods. So there is more practical workshops about first interviews, then visual methods, survey study, and R software, and finally survey data. Lastly, end of March, so also today we have our last lecture, is when Brittany will talk about how to write specifically a methods chapter. There's a skill of writing a methods chapter, so this is a particular part of your dissertation. And there's a skill of writing it because you don't, as we mentioned, we not only have to write what you did, but why you did it and how it stems from everything else in your dissertation. So, this will start next week. The sign-up will start next week. The workshops will also start next week. Okay. Any questions about? Yes.
Will these be on lecture capture?
I'm hoping that they will be, but I will double check. Yeah.
No, I was just wondering because there's like a few that I want to go to that are at a time that I have a different seminar.
Yes. I'll check with IT. There should be because I've asked for those, but it's a good question. I'll come back to you on Monday. It's a good question. There were some other questions. No? Yes.
You mentioned that we need to submit our abstract before February the 20, the 5, the 20. But I think brainstorming our project is on February 20th. That means we need to decide our topic before brainstorming.
Yes.
We don't know why. Because maybe we need to do brainstorming first and then submit our abstract.
So the point of this session is to go starting from your submitted abstract, right? You have your abstract, you had the whole term, and you have the half of this term to think about what you want to do. Right? It should be informed by the courses you took, by the knowledge you bring into this course, by any questions that you're interested in. Right? So we're not thinking about this as needs to be structured, right? There's some freedom of how to write this abstract. This form, it's important that you submit it, but it doesn't have to be like an essay. It doesn't have to be structured or formatted in any way. It's just to make you start thinking about that. And the purpose of this session is say, okay, you've done the initial work. Maybe you contacted your supervisor already. Maybe you're now getting too much information because you submitted this. You got some initial feedback maybe from your supervisor. You got some talks with other teachers. You've read something new. Now you're confused how to take it forward. So this is what this workshop is for. It's how to bring it all together. Okay, so let's talk about research design. Why do we need research design and methodology? Because world is a very complicated place, I think is the answer. And depending on how we look for things, we will find different kinds of answers. Depending on what questions we pose, depending on what approach we take, our view of the world and our findings will be different. So it stems from the social constructivist tradition, this statement, and I will go through this a little bit later, that there is no one way of observing the world. There is no one objective way of observing something that happens. There are different methods in observing and different perspectives. Each of these methods, each of these perspectives has advantages and has weaknesses. But each has been used before. Each of the methods we'll talk about has an established research methodology you will follow. So knowing what is good research design will give you the necessary tools to produce not only evidence that is valuable and claims they are scientific, but will allow you to contribute to the debate, will allow you to contribute to the debate you establish in your literature review. These will not be just your thoughts, your opinions, but by following a scientific process, you will provide evidence that will stand on par with all the other scientific works in the area. So we need to think about research design with connection to research question and theory. You need to think about research design to make sure that the type of evidence you need will be pursued by the right question. The right research design will give you an answer to your research question that will be a convincing answer. So there's a very strong link between these three. You have your research question, which is grounded in theory. It stems from theory. You read theory, you identified gaps. You have your research question grounded in this theory. And then you need appropriate methods in order to be able to answer them. And I keep coming back to research question because research question is very important in every part of a dissertation. That's why the research question is in your dissertation abstract form. And it's not final. But I want you to start thinking about research questions at this very early stage, because research question will weave its way throughout your project. You need to have your research question in the literature review section, in your research design, and in your discussion. The point of your dissertation, I can't stress it enough, is to answer your research question in a scientific way. So these are two approaches that you might have to your research design. The first one is you start with a method. I want to do surveys, but I don't know what to do actually. I don't have a topic, but I know I want to do surveys.
That's not a good approach. Right? If you start with the method, you don't follow the theory, you don't follow the research question, you try to then fit your research question and research topic to your to the method you like. Right? This has certain consequences to how valid your evidence will they be, because many research questions will not fit into this method. You'll be very limited what you can and what you can do. So of course you might have a preference for qualitative methods over quantitative methods, and that's absolutely fine. But I would like to encourage you to start with topics and start with theories and start with things that you find interesting in the world. And then based on that, craft your questions, and based on that, choose your methods. So instead of saying, I want to do surveys, your line of thinking might go something like this. I'm interested in this topic. I'm interested in comparing, let's say, male and female use of Instagram in country X, Germany, let's say. Okay, that's good. That's a bit broad. So what exactly are you interested in? Let's say I'm interested in whether gender is a significant factor in what people post on Instagram in Germany. Whether male users post more than female users, or they post different type of content. I'm sure it's a very interesting research question, but it is one. So we have that. Now, is there any theory? And you might go to any theory that will let you answer it. Let's say you went with concept of affordances. What Instagram as a platform affords you to do in terms of structural limitation, in terms of the culture of the platform. And you probably need something about the people who use it, so some theory of users, some audience theory. But it's still a bit broad. So are we interested in what individually, why do people post? Why do men post certain things? And why do women post certain things? Let's say I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in broad general trends. I want to have a large corpus of data and see statistically, are men more likely to post certain type of content and women more likely to post different kind of content. Well, that's clear now. I want to do surveys because I want to have a large corpus of data that will allow me for statistically significant trend analysis. If I was interested in particular users and their motivations and their interpretation of the platforms, I might have considered interviews. If I was interested in how Instagram is structured in terms of platform, I might do some kind of textual analysis. But I'm not. I'm doing this. So I've reached the point of research design. I will do surveys. So this is ideally the kind of thinking that you're doing now and you'll be doing for the next weeks. So some helping questions. Starting from theory. Why is this case interesting? Are there any unanswered questions? Do you know of any theories that might help us explain it? If you don't, then maybe we need one. Do you know what actually you will research? I mean, I know that this topic is interesting for you, or this technology, or this trend, but what actually is it that you will research? What is your question? So this red box is, I think, where many of you are now. And hopefully, after submitting your abstract, you'll be further along, because you will have your research question, even though it might change. And then we might start thinking, okay, so you have the question, what is the most appropriate way to answer it? How will you know that you answered the question? So think about yourself gathering data, interviewing people, doing surveys, analyzing text, analyzing images, analyzing videos. At what point you will say, okay, this is answered. Right? So imagine yourself, what will you need in order to make a convincing argument about this question? And then operationalization. So how will you measure things in order to answer it. If your question is about pleasure, what pleasure do certain users of platforms have? Well, how will you define pleasure? How will you measure pleasure? Right? If your question is about addiction, are young people addicted to social media? Well, how will you measure addiction? Right? So if you have a concept, think about what tools you will have to measure them. So the blue box is the sort of research design, and the green box is, okay, then what do you do? Your analysis. You have your data, and you're trying to answer your question. You found out some things. Now the task is to connect those findings to other theories and concepts. You said, well, I found those things, but some other scholars found other things. Or I found those things, and they go in line to what this theory says. Right? So what does this say about your question, your particular topic, the field of study, the theory, the world? So this is where you come and say, this is my contribution, this is my original contribution within the field, within this phenomenon. So I mentioned those constructivist tradition, and I think I'll briefly mention it because there's no one way of doing science. So how do we know stuff? How do we know what happens in the world? How do we do research? How do we know that something is science and not just random observation that we do every day? So when does science become science? Now, there are different traditions to that, and I just briefly want to mention two. So the positivist tradition. So traditionally, this is the tradition that was posing that there is an objective truth in the world. There are certain universal rules guiding the world. And when we observe it objectively, we don't interfere, we are not biased, we look at it carefully, we can uncover that truth. We can see how things work. The constructivist tradition says, well, it's not that simple. Knowledge is not out there. Knowledge is not objective. Knowledge is being socially constructed by all of us. What we think of truth is contingent on our experience, of our reflection, of our values. People construct their own truths. People construct their own understanding through their lives, through experience, and through reflecting on it. So you sort of need to position yourself somewhere here, right? And because it will have consequences to the methods you do. Even doing interviews, right? So that the positivist tradition in interviews would be then, well, we ask people questions, and our role as asking questions is to stay objective, to not interfere too much, and try to avoid any type of bias. And this is how we will uncover the truth. The constructivist tradition of interview, this is something Pete might go into in a couple of weeks, will be that it's never objective. Any interview, any survey, is never an objective situation. There's always power relation. We're asking questions, somebody else is answering them. There's always pressure, there's always power, there's always different factors that will affect the process. What we can do as researchers then is then reflexive. It's careful to record all those things and try to untangle them. Right. So now let's talk briefly about different methods. This doesn't cover, before I go into that, this doesn't cover all the methods. So I will talk about, I think, 6 or 7 methods that are quite often chosen by students, that students enjoy doing, but it doesn't mean that you cannot choose a different method that is not covered by here. This is something you do with your supervisor. You say, I want to do this new method, I want to do this method that I've heard about, I've read about, I think it's appropriate to this research, and you take it forward with them. Starting with observation, right? So the ethnographic tradition of observing, or even participant observation when you're part of the context, is very helpful to see social life in depth, because it allows you to be there, right? You're not reading about it, you're not asking people about it, but you actually are there to witness it. You observe people as they behave naturally, and say it's never naturally because you're there, but it's more naturally than, say, through interviews. So you can, if you were to observe hacking groups, for example, how they create code, how they do whatever hacking groups do, right? You can ask them about it, you can survey them about it, but participant observation, actually going there and seeing what they do, spending time with them, will give you insight about their deep cultural context, about what they do, and not just what they say they do. The weakness is that first is very laborious, it takes time. It doesn't always work in closed communities. People might not want you around. And it's limited to a small sample, right? You can only do so much as a single person. You can observe somebody for a couple of hours and another person, but your sample would be very limited. Interviews, on the other hand, give you a chance to interact with individuals on a more personal basis, because you're talking usually one-to-one. You can do focus groups too, of course. And it lets you interact with them more directly by asking questions, not just seeing, but asking the things you're interested in. So this is where you go to for a research question that have to do with people's experiences, people's attitudes, what people think about stuff, how people interpret things. So it would be not only what people do, but why they do them. If you want to ask them, well, why do you think you do that? Again, weaknesses, probably sample will be small as well. We cannot generalize. If we interview 10 or 20 people about their social media use, we cannot say, well, then all people do that. We can't. It's too small of a sample to generalize. But we can say, well, we uncovered a range of factors, a range of uses that let us understand this phenomenon a little better. Experiments are an interesting method, because that's really the only method that lets us understand cause and effect. Right? So do media and technology cause something? Do they have an impact on something? The only way to really do that in a convincing way is to create an experiment, create a situation in which some people are exposed to something, and then we measure their reaction, or we measure how they behave. Quite, again, laborious to set up, sometimes tricky in terms of ethical clearance, depending on what your experiment is. Sometimes might not work, right? Very simply. The next three, questionnaires or surveys. These also have to do with people, so this will be any questions about what people do, just like observation, just like interviews. But they'll be different in that we will gather large data. We will gather data from hundreds of people rather than tens, which will allow us to compare trends, to compare statistical significance, to see whether certain factors correlate with other factors, to see that certain factor is significant in this or not. We can use it to gauge people's routines, but it will be quite superficial, right? We cannot ask those deep questions that we would do in the interview, such as, well, why do you do it? How do you think your childhood affects whatever you do now? Right? These are questions that you cannot really ask via surveys. Right? We can ask questions, well, how many times per day do you check your phone? And have a survey. That's a survey question. And then the last two are both textual analysis. And there are some different methods to do that. And I'll introduce them in the workshops later. But we can divide them into qualitative and quantitative content analysis. Qualitative content analysis will be, again, we look at smaller sample in depth. We look at text, and as we said, anything can be a text. A text can be a website, it could be a video, it could be a tweet, or it could be a newspaper article. But if we do qualitative analysis, it will allow us to look at the meaning embedded in text deeply, in context of power, in context of economy, in context of society. We will look at where this text is placed, where it was published, who wrote it, who is responsible, what effects it has, because it's on a certain platform and not for other. Right? So we will go in depth in this text. Right? So comparing 5 different platforms, for example, or looking at 2 online movies and analyzing them. So just like interviews, it will not allow for generalization because we have a small sample, but we will look in depth. On the other hand, quantitative content analysis will allow us to compare trends across textual content and talk about generalization. So this is large sample. Let's say we have 200 tweets, right? Or we have 300 survey responses, and then we do quantitative content analysis on them, right? We count stuff, and we see how significant it is. And we come up with certain numbers. We say 63% of these texts contain the word this. 80% of tweets about these politicians are negative or positive. We can look at trends across time, right? Before the election, most tweets were positive, but after, most are negative. We can do those comparisons because we have a large corpus of data. Okay, I'm going to quiz you now. Which method would you use to answer these research questions? There's not always one correct answer, but there's one that is better than the others, at least according to me, but we can talk about this. So, these 8 methods here: interviewing, observation, network analysis, visual analysis, quantitative textual analysis, qualitative textual analysis, experiments and surveys. Which of them, based on what we said today, would you use to answer this research question? Can exposure to online horror videos increase violent tendencies in teenagers? Do you know the answer? Okay, so raise your hands. Is it 1, interviewing, 2, observation, 3, network analysis, 4, visual analysis? Sorry, so there's some nodding, but I need hands. 3, network analysis, 4, visual analysis, 5, quant textual, 6, qual textual, 7, experiments, 8, surveys. Okay, good. So we have a tie between experiments and surveys with a slight leaning toward experiments. Experiments, which was my preferred answer, was because, well, why? Yeah, because causality, right? Because it asks specifically about cause and effect. Do they increase violent tendencies in teenagers? It's very difficult to answer this question with other methods. And I know why you went for surveys,
and it's a good guess, because you could interview, you could send the surveys to 200 teenagers, or maybe even better, to their moms, and ask them how many times a day your son watches this. Do you think their behavior has changed, yes or no, right? That's a fun study, but it will probably tell us more about the moms rather than the sons and daughters, right? And there's no way to verify this. There's no way to sort of look, well, this is the cause. Because there might be other factors, right? Maybe there is a factor of class, of culture, of upbringing, of what kind of content. This is a very complicated question. The only way we can identify those factors is to set up some kind of experiment when we expose people to this content and then ask them to do something without telling them that this is about violent tendencies, but something that will reveal that their behavior might have been affected by this. Good. How is gender represented on viral YouTube content? Interviewing, observation, okay, network analysis, visual analysis, quant textual analysis, qual textual analysis, experiments, surveys. Some of you had your hands up the whole time. That was good. No, I respect that. You could, I suppose. These are my preferred three, although listen, I mean, I take your argument. So I think this question is quite, I don't have the question. This question is quite wide. How is gender represented in the viral YouTube content? It's a very wide research question. It requires some narrowing down. It could be visual analysis if we're interested in just the visuals. It could be quantitative textual analysis if we're interested in very simple categories. And we will have a lot of YouTube content, so 200 YouTube videos, and we're only interested in, I don't know, how many visibly male characters and visibly female characters appear. We'll just be counting them. Right? So this could be quantitative study. If we want to go deep in representation, how is gender represented through the roles they have? So how maybe men are represented in terms of authority, and how are women represented in terms of authority? Right. So more elaborate categories. We probably have a smaller corpus, and qualitative textual analysis, discourse analysis, or visual analysis would be more appropriate. You can do the other ones if you rephrase the question a little bit, but the question asked about content, right? It didn't ask about users, it didn't ask about people, it didn't ask about producers, it asked about content. So that means we need to analyze the text. If we don't want to analyze the text, we need to rephrase the question.
I think I have one more. Are young urban people more likely to share online content than young people in rural areas? Interviewing? Observation? Network analysis? Visual analysis? Quantitative textual? Qualitative textual? Experiments? Surveys? All right, yes, good. That was the winner too.
Although there was a good split. Why surveys? And again, you could go for a number of them. I'll go through them. But as it is, without qualifying, it asks first about comparison, right? Which means that we need significant amount of data, significant sample to compare those two groups. We need a significant young people living in a city group and young people living in a rural area group. It also asks about how are people more likely to do something, right? So that sounds a little bit like statistical inference about how people are more likely. It asks about probability. Right? So it sounds like something we need to have a large corpus of data, and compare factors and say, well, based on this data, we need to do some generalization. We cannot just have 5 young boys from big city and 5 young boys from a small village and compare them, because that's not enough to say all young people do this, all young people do this. And you say, generally, can we compare them? That's why I would say surveys. If we qualify this a little bit, and maybe avoid this word likely, then we could do other methods as well. But the key thing here is, it's asking about people, not texts, not institutions, it's asking about people. That means we'll be limited to surveys, interviewing and observation. Maybe network analysis, maybe experiments, depending on what are we interested in. Okay. So, this is how I would like you to be thinking about your research question. These two have to match. It doesn't mean that there's only one way of answering your research question, but there's always the preferable way, the one that will give you the most convincing answer. Please start discussing this with your peers, with your teachers, and very soon with your supervisors. Right. Oh, we have one more. Let's do very quickly. Why do people stream their online gaming practices? Somebody shout out the answer. Interviewing? Yay! Or observation. Right? Why? We cannot get this from a survey. We would have to have a million categories. Why do you do that? For fun, for money, for pleasure. This is very difficult. Right? We can observe them doing this, or we can interview them and go in depth into this issue. Good. No real time for questions, but I'll be here to take them individually. Remember to see Pete here on Friday, 8th February. You will receive an email from me next Monday with links to sign up to optional workshops. I'll find out about the number. I'll find out about recording them. I'm not sure they will be recorded now that I think about it, because they're in smaller halls, but I'll find out. Okay.